Hello, good morning, and welcome or welcome back if this isn't your first time. Um, my name's Peter Sumpton, I'm a marketing consultant, but I'm delighted to be leading this, or these webinars, should I say, for the BBA. This is the final one of 2021, so we won't see you again until 2022, but you probably had enough of us by now. So what a great way to finish the year than to be joined, and I'll introduce them a little bit later on once I've introduced the BBA, as I normally do. Delighted to be joined by Manochehr Salek, who is a BBA technical assessor. And he's going to be talking about all things 1090, everything you need to know to remain compliant, which I'll come on to in a couple of slides' time. But first of all, let's take a look at who the BBA are, what we're doing here, how you can find things. Okay, so this is a webinar. We do a number of webinars. We've got some coming up, or a lot coming up next year. This is the last one of this year, but if you want to go back and have a look at any previous ones, then you can do so by simply going to the BBA website and clicking on the webinar feature at the top, as you can see there, the link there. And then if you scroll down on this page, there's the future webinars which are coming up, including this one today. And then if you scroll down a bit further, you'll have the previous webinars. So you can take a look back at any of our webinars by doing this. Just click the watch it back, and that will take you to the specific webinar page, which you can download the slides, and you can re-watch any part of any webinar. If you don't want to miss out on any future webinars that are coming up that aren't on this page, subscribe to the mailing list. So the link's on there, and the best way to do that is to go to the website, scroll down to the bottom, and subscribe. We won't spam you, we'll just send you interesting things, promise. And if we do, just unsubscribe or tell us we've been naughty and we'll stop it. Okay, so who the BBA? So for 55 years, starting in 1966, the BBA have been helping the construction and manufacturing industries build confidence in the solutions, designs, creations, manufacturing, production, throughout the entire supply chain. We look to build confidence and long-term partnerships with our clients and associations. And we look to enable continued growth, not just in the UK, but as a global marketplace. It's important to remember that the BBA will always remain reassuringly impartial. We're here to help the whole construction industry. And because of that, the BBA are actually a for-profit organisation limited by guarantee. And that means they look to invest any profits they make into the industry as a whole, or for the benefit of the industry as a whole, which ideally benefits me, yourselves, and the wider construction community, the benefit of all stakeholders, if you like. What do the BBA actually do? Well, the BBA are more commonly known for their PAC, Product Approval Certification, which includes the BBA Agreement Certification. But you might not know, but we also do reproduction certificate, HAPAS, which is highways certification. But we also do a lot of other things to do with testing, audit and inspection, management systems such as ISO 9001, and more recently, UKCA marking. And as we announced yesterday, we're the first to be able to issue UK TAs. That's the transition from ETAs to UKTA. So if you're interested in any of that, get in touch with us and we can sort you out. But this isn't a sales pitch, far from it. I just wanted to highlight what the BBA actually do. And to date, we've issued over 6,000 certificates. And that big, massive number in the bottom right, we do over 8,000 annual inspections and assessments. So we're pretty busy because there's only 170 plus people here at the BBA. That's enough about that. On to today. And this is what we'll cover. We're going to cover everything to do with BSEN 1090. We'll look at construction product regulations, who enforces compliance and the consequences of not conforming to those compliance. What is 1090? What products does it cover? who must comply, the routes to compliance, which is massively important, and the role of the BBA in all this. And finally, for the final time this year, we will take any questions you may have in our Q&A session at the very end. So please, 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 if you do have any questions, use the question functionality in this webinar. And if we don't have time at the end, I promise you we will get back to you in some way, shape or form, like we've done for every question we've got on every webinar this year. We're here again to help the entire construction industry. Okay, that's enough from me. I'd like to bring our presenter on stage today, Manochehr Salek. Manochehr, welcome. Delighted to have you with us today.
Hello, good morning.
And I'm going to hand over to yourself. So I'm going to move on to your first slide, and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, of course, the topic of today is EN 1090 and steel and aluminium structures. But in order to get the significance of these standards, we need to go to the beginning, that the regulation which makes these standards so important. The regulation that relates to any construction product is a construction product regulation 2013, and the amendments which came in after EU exit in 2019 and 2020. The construction product regulation 2013 has very simple message at its heart. It basically says it is against the law to supply a construction product if there is a European harmonized norm for it or a European technical assessment. And if you do not draw a declaration of performance on CE mark or UK CE mark from end of next year, then this is illegal. So the compliance with EN standard, which now referred to as designated standard, is a legal requirement. Failure to comply with these regulation, I'm talking about CPR regulation, you could be liable for a summary conviction to imprisonment or a fine. So it is very important that we understand the construction product regulation first. So if there is a standard for a product, the compliance with that standard is mandatory, is a legal requirement. Next page, please. Okay, so the construction product regulation, which we mentioned, covers any construction product for which there is a harmonized standard. The trading standard authorities enforce compliance with this regulation. It's them who would come around to say, does your product comply with the regulations? And obviously, if the regulation highlights a European norm, does it comply with this European norm? The enforcement, the trading standard authorities have got significant powers on the CPR. They can inspect any construction product and any premises, as long as it's not a residential premise. They can obviously examine any procedure connected with the production of the construction product and examine any records. If there is a container, the door is locked, they can open it or they can break it open to get access to the products or record. So trading standard authorities are the ones who would go around factories who make a construction product item, and they want to know if they are compliant with the law. So they are the ones who would come in contact with manufacturers or suppliers first, and to find out if you're in breach of the regulations. Next slide, please. Okay. If you find that you're non-compliant with the regulation, there are obviously significant consequences for these. First instance is breaking the law, facing a fine or a prison term. And if you're not compliant with the construction product regulation, you would be non-compliant with the building regulation, with the local authorities. There could be potential issues with a building insurance requirement, because should something happen to a structure and the insurance company finds out, oh, the building was maybe built illegally, there is potential that the insurance company may refuse to pay out. Many of the major construction projects, many utilities now specify compliance with the construction product regulation. They are aware of these, so people could be excluded from some of these projects, and of course, loss of business or business disruption if being non-compliant with the construction product regulation. Next slide, please. Okay, we mentioned in construction product regulation, they say if there is a construction product for which there is a harmonized European norm, you must comply with that. With regards to aluminium and steel structures, the harmonized European norm is EN 1090. So EN 1090 gets its teeth from construction product regulation, from CPR. So CPR has made it mandatory to comply with this standard. EN 1090 has got, in the main, has got three parts. The part one, which is EN 1090-1, is to do with the conformity assessment. The part two relates to execution. Is actually in the manufacturing of a structure of steel, particularly in relation with steel. The part two is in relation with the steel, and part three is to do with execution of the aluminium structures. As I mentioned earlier on, compliance with EN 1090 is a mandatory requirement and a legal obligation because of CPR. CPR makes it mandatory, a legal requirement to comply with this EN 1090. Next slide, please. Now, the products which are covered by this standard, okay, the most important acid test is if it's made from steel or aluminium, if it is structural and load-bearing and permanent, then is covered by this standard. Just to give you some examples, and again, it's not limited to this. This is just some example: agricultural sheds, portal frame for warehouses, industrial sheds, frames for building, dwelling, offices, commercial, hospital, education, etc., sheds, staircases, balconies, canopies, structural fences, fire escape ladders, catwalks, walkways, etc. These are all structural, they're permanent, they're load-bearing, so they're covered by this standard. What is not covered by the standard, for example, if the product has got an alternative other than EN 1090 standard that it must comply with. So if there is another European norm that the construction product must comply with, then it's not covered by EN 1090. Anything which is non-structural, for example, architectural components, they are not covered by EN 1090. Temporary works are not covered by EN 1090, and of course, offshore structures are not covered by EN 1090. Next slide, please. Okay, so who must comply with CPR and EN 1090 standard? It could be an individual who manufactures even a bracket. If it is a structural bracket, if it is load-bearing, then compliance with CPR and EN 1090 is mandatory. Or it could be an organization, the manufacturer, or somebody who places the products on the market. These are the ones who must comply with the regulation. So the size of organization doesn't matter. It could be, as I said, an individual. If they are making anything which is a structural, load-bearing and permanent, then they must comply. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can somebody become compliant with these? Now, in order to achieve compliance with a standard and in effect CE market or UKCA market, you need to do two things. Number one, you must obtain or secure a factory production control certificate. They call them an FPC as per requirement of EN 1090. This can only be issued by a notified body. It's unlike ISO 9001. FPCs in relation to EN 1090 can only be issued by a notified body such as BBA. Next, for the component which is produced, needs to go a declaration of performance, a DOP needs to be drawn up, which in effect actually CE marks it or UKCA mark it. It doesn't have to be actually physically, for example, with the structure to be CE marked itself. That declaration of performance in effect CE marks the product or UKCA marks the product. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the role that notified bodies such as BBA plays in this, we carry out an initial assessment of the manufacturer, and we check the factory production control, the documented procedures for that. So we complete an initial assessment. If it is successful, then we issue them an FBC certificate. That FBC certificate is required for the manufacturer to draw up a declaration of performance. And after that, we do a continuous surveillance. The frequency of these are all listed within the standard. We do the surveillance, we do the assessment, and for as long as the company remains compliant, then the factory production control certificate remains valid. Of course, we've issued hundreds of these FBC certificates in relation to EN 1090, so we have a significant experience in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the key points of EN 1090? EN 1090 for the first time has introduced an execution class. Now, there are 4 execution classes, and if you wanted to put it in simple terms, it goes from, in terms of quality and the requirement, it goes from execution 1 to execution 4. Execution 1 be the least onerous and execution class 4 to be the most. And it all depends on the application. Execution class is decided by the designer because he needs to take 3 things into account. He needs to take into account the consequences of failure. What would happen if this structure fails? That's one item. It could be an agricultural shed with 2 or 3 people in there, or it could be a commercial building with a few hundred people, or it could be a stadium with several thousand people in there. So the consequence of failure is important. He must take this into account. Next, he needs to take into account the production category. The material he specifies, how difficult it is to work with. So production category he knows. And finally, he must take into the service category. What is the kind of loading of that structure? Is it just static loading? Could it be subject to, for example, alternating loading to fatigue loading? So he takes those 3 items into account and decide on the execution class. There is a table, depending on the consequence class, service category, and production category, he can then decide whether it should be execution class 1, 2, 3, or 4. Just to give you an idea, the majority of FBC certificate are execution class 2, which are suitable for commercial residential building. Execution class 3 and 4 more likely to relate to concert halls, to football stadiums, that size of project. But the majority of the manufacturers secure an execution class 2 certificate. Of course, in PBA, we've issued many of these for all execution classes. Next slide, please. Okay, now the key points. In terms of significance, the main points of EN 1090. First, there must be a weld quality management system in place. Now, the relevant standard is 3834, and there are 3 classes of the weld quality management system. We have the elementary, standard, and comprehensive, and depends on the execution class. So a weld quality management system needs to be in place. Now, you also need a responsible weld coordinator. Somebody needs to be responsible for all welding activities and all that. And the requirement for this is listed in another EN standard, is 14731 for the welding coordination personnel. Next to that is, this is an important one. And there is a reason for this item. This is to do what they call a weld procedure specification. Now, what is the reason for that? Welding is a special process. You can never look at a weld and say, I think that weld is very good. So how can you have confidence in the welding you do? And the procedure for that is this weld procedure specification. You basically prepare a weld sample, you send it to an accredited lab, and they do the testing by X-rays. So both type of tests, all type of tests done on there, and the result come back and they say that these welds are good quality. The parameters for doing that weld sample are gathered, and then they will provide the procedure for that welding. So what they're saying, as long as you follow the same procedure when you did your sample, then there is likelihood that the welds you do in future are going to be good enough quality, acceptable quality. It's just to give confidence on every weld a manufacturer puts in there. So they draw up a weld procedure specification, which is the parameters for doing the welding, and then get the qualification records. So next to that, they will be provided by weld procedure specification qualification records, which ensures that for as long as you follow that, then the quality of the welding is good. Next slide, please. Okay, the other important areas that we normally cover under assessment is to see how contracts are reviewed, the technical review of these contracts, any subcontracting is done. Does the manufacturer provide sufficient information to the subcontractor in order for them to do the subcontracting? So this is important. Equipment we look at to make sure the manufacturer has got suitable equipment to carry out the structural steel work. The premises need to be suitable. For example, it's not the kind of work that you can do outside with the wind blowing, etc. So you need to have suitable premises. How the welding consumables are handled, because sometimes they can be affected by moisture, etc. How the parent material, the steel is stored, are they still stored outside? What happens with corrosion, etc.? If there are any post-weld heat treatment, we need to see the procedure for that. The procedure for testing before, during, and after welding, these need to be documented. How non-conformance or corrective actions are dealt with, again, this needs to be documented in the weld quality management system of the company. Any measuring devices that is used need to be under control in terms of regular inspection, calibration, and also keeping record of these to make sure, starting from tape measures to engineer squares to welding equipment, need to be calibrated or inspected, examined. They need to be under control. And for example, for execution class 3 and above, identification and traceability is absolutely critical, that everything in relation to that structure needs to be traceable from the raw material right over to the handover. And the quality records which are kept, these are the areas we look into. To be honest, the EN 1090 compliance can be kept as simple or as complicated as possible, for as long as you remain compliant with the standard. And depending on the size of the organization. Next slide, please. Oh, this was the end of it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Fantastic, thank you. Abrupt ending there, but absolutely superb. I think we covered quite a lot of ground there. Really interesting, a lot of things that I didn't know about 1090. So Manochehr, thank you so much for all your knowledge and imparting that today.
My pleasure.
Okay, so a couple of questions. First one is from Mohammed. Hello, Mohammed. And he says that he designs, fabricates, and installs as per 1090. And his question is it compulsory for me to have in-house structural engineering, or can he get the design done by a freelancer?
This is a very good question. It is basically, you do not need to have structural engineer in-house. By structural engineer, I mean somebody who does structural calculations. This is very important, that the structural calculation do not need to be done in-house. They can be subcontracted by somebody else. However, if you employ someone who does structural calculation, then during this assessment, the suitability will be examined, i.e. is part of EN 1090 for us to check to make sure he's suitably qualified, his premises where he works is suitable, and also the equipment, for example, the software and all that he uses are compliant. But if they're outside, obviously we don't need to check them. So he can subcontract that part of it, and as part of our assessment, we will not do any examination of the external structural engineer, if you like.
Okay, fantastic, Mohammed. Hopefully that answers your question. We've got a question from Christopher here. Thank you for joining us, Christopher. And he says, how is EN 1090 manufacture in the UK qualified to CE? So I think that's asking how it qualifies in Europe. Is it the same?
Yeah. I completely understand what he's saying. If I understand correctly, what he says, if I produce something in UK and UK CA market, how can I send that to France, for example? Because it doesn't have. How it happens, if we've issued you the FPC certificate, and from beginning of this year, you cannot CE mark. You can no longer CE mark with an FPC issued in UK by a UK notified body. You can only UK CA mark. So in order to send your product in Europe, BBA has got arrangement with a notified body in Europe. Basically what they do, they look at our factory production control reports, the reports that we've done at the manufacturer. They look at those and they say, oh yeah, we are happy with that, and they will issue an FPC certificate by a notified body in Europe. You use that in order to CE mark your product and ship it to France without any difficulty. And the same goes if it is vice versa. If somebody is importing from, for example, France, which is something CE marked, and bring it into UK, we find out who's the notified body who's done the factory production control assessment. BBA will read those reports and all that. If we are happy, we'll issue an FPC certificate in UK in order to allow you to UK CA mark that product. It's relatively straightforward procedure, which allows for goods manufactured in UK to be CE marked for going into Europe, and vice versa, manufactured in Europe to come into UK with a UK CA mark. Hopefully that answers your question.
Just following on from that question, then David May, who's joining us. Hello, David. He asks, what are the key differences between CE and UK CA? Is there still a standard change between CE and UK CA? Go on.
Yeah. First of all, this is the bizarre thing. The standard has not changed one bit. It's the same standard. Since leaving EU, of course, people in the UK or the politicians don't like to refer to these as European norms. So they give them a different name. They call them now designated standard. But I can assure you, absolutely nothing has changed. It's the same standard. It is what it is. You know, but the standard have not changed. And it is worth bearing in mind, UK has contributed significantly, maybe disproportionately, to developing this standard. And of course, we'll continue working with European partners to develop the standards. And this has nothing to do with the single market or the custom union. Is an agreement based on a standard. And I think they're highly unlikely to change in the future. But anyway, the standards have not changed. It's the same standard.
I've got a couple more questions here, and then we'll start to wrap up. Mr. Robert Armour, who's joining us today, he actually says, "Hi, Mr. Salek. Is there any plans? Is there any plans to update the 1090 standard?"
At the moment, I'm not aware of, but I'm sure all these standards are being under reviewed and all that. As it stands at the moment, I'm not aware of any upcoming soon. But EN 1090 is not perfect by any stretch of imagination. There is anomalies on there, etc. So I would imagine at some point it will be reviewed.
Fantastic. Let's take this final question. We've gone full circle. And final one from Mohammed Javed, who asked the first question. And the final question for today and this year is there a difference between Certificate of Conformity and FPC, or are they both the same thing?
No, they are completely different. An FPC is a factory production control, okay? Basically, just to make it very, very simple, you could have a factory and ask, you may not have done any work at all before. You ask a notified body, can you come and see if I'm suitably qualified to do structural steel, right? So the notified body like BBA will arrive there, and check all the relevant stuff in relation to EN 1090. Is your premises suitable, equipment, personnel, etc., all the things we mentioned, and issues you with a factory production control certificate. Now, a certificate of conformity is different. A certificate of conformity means this product complies with certain standard, or they call it a declaration of performance. In order to express that your product complies with the European norm, normally you draw up a declaration of performance in relation to that standard. That declaration of performance is what UKCA marks the product, or CE marks the product.
Okay, fantastic. I was going to wrap it up there, but we've got one final question, if that's okay, Manochehr.
Of course, fire away.
Excellent. So this is from Robbie Lowe's. Hello, thank you so much for being patient to answer this question. It's quite a long one, but I think it's quite a simple one. So it says, thank you for your presentation, which is always good to hear. When assessing the suitability of a structural engineer, what related qualifications would be looked for? For example, a degree in civil mechanical engineering, membership of an engineering institute, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You know, this is a very interesting question. And I tell you, this is one of the issues with the EN 1090. Can I just give you a bit of a background to this?
Absolutely.
Where there is an anomaly in the EN 1090, if there is a structural engineer employed within the company, within the organization that we are doing an assessment, if they're employed there, and when I say structural engineer, somebody who's doing a structural calculation, we need to assess the suitability, okay? However, if that guy is across the road from your company, set up as a separate structural engineer, he doesn't need to be assessed. That to me is not right. So going back to the question, if you employ a structural engineer who's doing a structural calculation, we need to make sure that he's suitably qualified. For example, is it qualified structural engineer? Does he have a membership of the relevant body? Is he registered with the local authorities? How much experience he has? We also check the software they use, because, you know, as far, you know, I'm a mechanical engineer, by the way. I'm not a structural engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer. I know there is for example, some of the software they use in structural calculation does not fully take into account the requirements of Eurocodes. So the Eurocode requirement need to be taken into account separately. So these are the kind of thing we will check. And even down to premises, you know, is this office suitable? So premises, equipment, personnel, those three items would be checked. And another thing I have to say, it is very rare that manufacturers actually employ a structural engineer. Normally these are done outside the company, so it is very rare. I have to say, I think in past several years I've been doing this, I think I've come across 2 companies which actually employs a structural engineer. And again, when I say structural engineer, somebody who does structural calculations. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, fantastic. And yeah, we're going to wrap it up there. So finally, from myself and the BBA, thank you so much for joining us. You're the most important people on this webinar, and from me, the most important people in the industry, because you want to learn and you want to listen to what Manochehr is saying. So fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. Manochehr, thank you so much for spending the time to go through those questions and imparting your valuable knowledge for everybody today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Excellent. So finally, from me, last time this year, have a great holiday, whatever you're doing. If you're having a break or if you're just working right through, enjoy it, and we will see you next year. So thank you so much, and it's goodbye for this year.